Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay. You're listening to the new Discourses podcast, and we are back into our long, sprawling series called The Nazi Experiment, where we're really basically just exposing that what we're facing with the woke right propaganda, but some even from the left as well, is a lot of repackaged Nazi ideology taken out of context so that the people who are hearing it, mostly young men in the conservative movement, don't know that they're just encountering repackaged Nazi content. So what's happening, as you've heard in a lot of the episodes so far, is that our young men, in particular in the conservative movement, are being fed, or we're seeing all over social media at least, and in podcasts, arguments that were made by Adolf Hitler adapted now to our current present circumstances without noticing that, for all the noticing that these people do, that these arguments are ultimately based in Mein Kampf and Nazi political theory and so on. And so we've already done a bunch of episodes of this, 12 full-blown episodes, a prequel, which means 13, and then a explainer plus a bonus episode. So we're way up in the double digits now. And in this episode, we're going to explore, not in its kind of fullness, but in a particular narrow angle, we're going to explore a little bit about religion in the Third Reich. So how Christianity in particular was used in Nazi Germany in order to change people's beliefs toward National Socialism. And just kind of summarize the point of the series again, in case for whatever reason this is your first encounter with it. The Nazi Experiment series wants to take a step back. We all know the Nazis were horrible. This is the problem. We apparently don't all know this anymore. We should all know, and all of us who are old enough know and are wise enough know that the Nazis were horrible. We know that they did their thing, they held power for 12 years, and that it sparked a world war, it caused a Holocaust, it caused the mass murder outside of Jews of millions of people the Nazis decided were defective or degenerate, and it was an utter catastrophe. Arguably one of the greatest catastrophes in human history is the outcome of the attempt to force a Nazi worldview into Europe, led, of course, by the Germans and Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP, which we all call the Nazi Party. So I want to take a step back and look at this and say, okay, the Nazis did an experiment, kind of a cold, calculating, scientific view of this. Okay, so they had some circumstances. They had lost World War I. They were upset about that. Their society was kind of flying off the rails in certain ways under the Weimar Republic, which was this kind of decadent, parliamentary, vaguely liberal, weak government that had been installed with tons of sanctions placed on them after World War I, tons of humiliation for the loss of World War I, tons of Germans wanting to know how in the world they, the greatest imperialists who could possibly ever have been, with the strongest and most powerful race that's ever lived, could possibly have lost World War I. And along come the Nazis with a answer. The Nazi Party arises in 1920, so we're talking right out of World War I. You have this organization of a handful, and I literally mean a handful, like 5 or 6 dorks, that became called the German Workers' Party. The Deutsche Arbeiter Party, okay, the DAP. Hitler gets involved. He's literally member number 6 or 7 or something like that. So when I said a handful of dorks, I literally mean a handful of dorks. Hitler gets involved in late 1919. I think he's being mentored by Dietrich Eckart, something like this, and he is trying to answer the question of how in the world all this went wrong. The National Socialist German Workers' Party is born out of this milieu that he is in, that he's taking part in, that's literally not even 10 members strong. And it basically lays a litany of accusations against Germany as it is following World War I, largely including that Germany had polluted itself by allowing in racial undesirables, and in particular not just Jews as racial undesirables as Hitler saw them, but Jewish influence, which he came to equate with Marxist influence. So Marxism, Jewish selfishness, Jewish ideology, Jewish racial presence, all being there in Germany, had watered down German solidarity around itself and its race, and had led, through beliefs in things like internationalism and whatever, to failing to adequately prepare for World War I, leading to its defeat. Then international Jewry and internationalists and the liberals around Europe and the parliamentarians all conspired against Germany following the loss in World War I, and put sanctions and humiliation heaped upon Germany for starting at what had been up to that point the worst war, the most destructive thing human beings had ever seen and had ever done to themselves and each other. Unbelievable, undescribable horrors come out of World War I. And the reeling attempt to explain this, the Nazis arise with an explanation that it is essentially racial pollution and the ideas that came along with that racial pollution that weakened Germany and costed everything. So Hitler puts forth, as we recount in the first few episodes of the series, a racialist worldview, a racial Weltanschauung, around which the entire Nazi experiment is going to be organized. Those are some of the most important episodes in the Nazi Experiment podcast series, where I lay out that racial Weltanschauung. And as I say, I think 13 or 14 times in the first episode, the first numbered episode, and as some of my friends have noted, probably applies 7 to 10 more times, so somewhere in the low 20s, you have just in that first chapter of the second volume of Mein Kampf, which I covered in volume 1, you have literally close to 24 instances where the rhetoric and the argument structures that we're hearing from the woke right today are just recycled arguments from Hitler's foundations for the Nazi experiment. And of course, this is seductive to people. We have young people who are frustrated, they are angry, they are whatever, and they don't believe in institutions. They think they've been lied to about everything. So why not about the Holocaust or the idea that Hitler and the Nazis were bad? Maybe that's a lie too. Maybe that was a lie just meant to control us all along, so we could install this free trade, global, internationalist, liberal order that's ruining their lives and it culminates in feminism or something. And that sounds like I'm mocking it, but this is actually the deal. And they're being sold this. So my point with the Nazi Experiment podcast series is that the Nazis did an experiment. That experiment is being repeated out of context. People do not know that they're encountering that. But we know the outcome of the Nazi experiment, which was rampant imperialism, massive devastation, a terrible world war, millions upon millions dead, and a Holocaust, which is a moral evil beyond anything other than maybe some of the, narrow acts of some of the communists. I go back and forth, obviously, with this argument with myself, which is worse, communism or fascism, communism or Nazism. And, every time I read something from one or the other, I decide it's got to be this one that's actually worse. But the truth is, while communism has murdered more people, it's actually probably true that Nazism is directly more evil because it sought to murder Jews and undesirable racial and genetic elements. It was eugenicist intentionally. It sought to murder them en masse, specifically in order to advance its own people, which is something the communists, for all their horrors, don't do. Communists try to transform your ideological belief and will kill you if you don't go along in awful and torturous and murderous, inhuman ways. They will initiate stupid programs and murder people who don't go along with them that end up causing mass starvations and famines that kill tens or even maybe over 100 million people. But with the exception of Pol Pot, you don't see this mass scale murder the same way that you see with the Nazis. So like I said, I'll go read something with the communists again and decide they're worse next week. But right now we're reading Nazis and it's like, holy moly, they're the worst thing ever. So the outcome of the Nazi experiment was catastrophe. The repetition of the Nazi experiment, therefore, is likely going to be catastrophe. No, guys, you are not going to make it work. It's not going to work this time. What is it? Jordan Peterson said about that. He says these totalitarian regimes, people think, they just didn't do it right. If they would have did this and that, if I would have been in charge, If I would have been in charge, it all would have worked out. Well, wake up, sunshine. You're no better than they are. In fact, you're probably worse. And so he's got a freaking point. And no, National Socialism is not going to work this time because it's American, or because it takes on American evangelical mainline Christianity, or because it takes on some goofy post-liberal theory based in so-called prudence, or because it's rooted in some weird Timu Catholic push that no one knows exactly what in the world it is, except that it seems to be funded, supported by, and celebrates Islamists everywhere it goes. Kind of like gives the game away a little bit. But anyway, it's not going to work. So the point of the Nazi Experiment podcast series is to say the Nazis did this experiment. What are the contents of the experiment? That's what the podcast series is about, and it didn't work, so we should not repeat it. But also to highlight that we are repeating it. Bad actors, not ignorant actors, bad actors in our midst are repackaging Hitler, Mussolini, Gentile, Evola, Schmidt, all these terrible characters, and feeding it to our young people without them knowing that the ideas that those men had consequences. And those consequences were some of the worst things that have ever happened in human history, and that those problems can be recreated. Those failures can be repeated. And if we take America off the board in the process, we're not going to have anybody to come save us. So the Nazi experiment is very important for us to understand. Like I said, in this episode, we're going to turn our attention to something completely different, which is something to do with religion in the Third Reich, but it's a complicated thing. We're going to talk about the Nazis' view of Christianity, which was called positive Christianity. And so, of course, as it would be, I had this queued up on my X, and then it just vanished on me because I waited too long to open it back up. Let me open this back up. How embarrassing. I'm going to read to you a post my friend and colleague Mike O'Fallon wrote on X. Let's see what date. It was a few days ago, 26th of February, 2026. He wrote, "In the wake of the 1933 ascent of Adolf Hitler to the chancellorship, the German Christian factions moved swiftly to consolidate ecclesial life beneath a national Reich Church aligned with the ambitions of the Nazi Party." And this is correct. They did establish a Reich Church very quickly after the Nazis took power. So Hitler becomes chancellor in January of 33. By the end of February of 33, you've had the Reichstag fire, and then through March of 1933, you very rapidly have the consolidation of powers, and Hitler claiming his dictatorship by the end of March 1933, after which point he started to make these radical changes very quickly, including the establishment of the Reichschurch. It says, this project, Mike O'Fallon says, this project required a theological severing of Christianity from its Jewish roots in both doctrine and tradition. To legitimize this rupture, the German Christians drew upon positive Christianity. So notice that the idea of positive Christianity predates the Reichschurch. They didn't invent this in 1933. They drew upon this, and he says, reshaping it into a doctrinal scaffold capable of sanctifying the ideological aims of the regime. What was called positive Christianity in Nazi Germany was not Christianity purified, but Christianity distorted. This is still Mike O'Fallon telling us. It was an attempt advanced and endorsed by the Nazi Party to harness elements of the Christian faith and subordinate them to a virulent nationalism and racial ideology. The movement sought to excise what it claimed was, quote, Jewish influence from the scriptures. You'll notice that virtually every character in the scriptures is Jewish, but never mind that. The movement sought to excise what it claimed was, quote, Jewish influence from the scriptures, recasting the faith into an Aryan state-serving religion and even reimagining Jesus in racialized militant terms. This horrific project was not a reform of Christianity, but a theological corruption, an example of what happens when divine revelation is bent to serve the spirit of the age rather than the lordship of Christ. So then he says why this matters. He goes on, Mike says, in our own day, we must be vigilant, for when certain radicalized forms of integralism and neo-integralism, whether arising from Protestant or Roman Catholic contexts, under the banner of what calls itself Christian nationalism, begin to conflate the kingdom of God with the machinery of the state, we are treading on perilous ground. Sacralism, as James White has pointed out for several years, he says, does not result in the preservation of the Christian faith and nearly always displays some form of religiously dispensed tyranny. So yes, we have seen this before. In Nazi Germany, the distortion known as positive Christianity represented a graceless, nationalized corruption of the faith, an effort to subordinate the gospel to ethnic identity and political power. Whenever the church weds herself to coercive nationalism and redefines the faith in service of temporal authority, she does not strengthen her witness or the gospel. She becomes a woman who rides the state beast. So, of course, we all know that Mike has a way with words, and that's what Mike had to say about positive Christianity. Now, what's interesting is on X, but even more so on Facebook, Mike's post got absolutely blown up. Like thousands upon thousands and thousands of trolls appeared on this post screaming all kinds of invective, calling him Jewish and like whatever else. So as you might expect. So what he's talking about has hit a nerve. And I think I've been meaning to do this podcast for a while, but it kind of kicked me over the edge to record this to see how absolutely screwed up the response was to Mike's claim. But the question is, okay, so is he wrong? Is that why people are mad? And the answer is no, he's not wrong. He is correct, as we're going to hear, about what positive Christianity is, what it represented, why it was used, and its weird parallels to the same story, repackaged arguments that the Christian nationalist movements of today are using out of context, without pointing to the fact. Even the fact that there's this weird ecumenicism between the radical traditional Catholics, the Timu Catholics, we should say, and these Timu reformed Theo bros, as they usually get called, the Christian nationalist movement. Even that reflects what was going on here with positive Christianity in the Third Reich. I'll point out that at the beginning of the Third Reich, the religious demography of Germany was almost completely 2/3 Protestant and 1/3 Catholic, 0.8% Jewish, and very little else. That's very like fractional quantities of anything else. So it was virtually all Protestant and Catholic in a ratio of about 2-1, which sounds kind of American situation-ish right now. Not to say that matters that much. Just to kind of explain, though, what is positive Christianity. First of all, it has no binding denomination. It doesn't have to be Protestant. It doesn't have to be Lutheran. It doesn't have to be Catholic. It doesn't have to be any particular denomination. But what it does have to do, as the Reich Minister for Church Affairs Hans Karel explained in 1937, is that positive Christianity will not be dependent upon the Apostles' Creed, nor will it be dependent on faith in Christ as the Son of God, upon which Christianity relies. Instead, it will be representing the Nazi Party. He went on to say the Führer is the herald of a new revelation. So you've already got something really crazy going on here where they think that Hitler and his utterances constitute a new revelation in the positive Christian church. It has a lot of ideas that Christians would not recognize. So when Mike says it was a corruption, it is a corruption. Positive Christianity differed from Nicene Christianity on purpose. By 1937, they're being open about that. I'm going to drill that date because we're going to read through the beginning of a book called Positive Christianity. I think it's called Positive Christianity in the Third Reich. Let me check the title. Yes, Positive Christianity in the Third Reich, that was published in 1935 and then edited and republished in 1937. So people should have known better by then. But the goal of Positive Christianity was, as Mike said, it was to write the Jewish parts out of the Bible, which is unbelievable, and to focus on the positive aspects, the positive attributes of Jesus's life. And this is this huge theological dispute that was apparently very big in Germany preceding the Nazis. between positive Christianity and negative Christianity? Do you focus on Jesus's life and his deeds, which were positive Christianity, or do you focus on Jesus's death and atonement, which they called negative Christianity? Positive Christianity, once it became Nazi, claimed Aryanhood as its kind of basis. It's a racial, ethno-religious Aryanhood to combat the ethno-religious nature of Jews. It claimed non-Jewishness for Jesus, and in fact asserted he was Aryan, that he was a Nordic Amorite specifically, who had wandered into the Levant. It saw Adolf Hitler as the German Messiah. And it, like I said, it rewrote Jesus as kind of this weird folk hero who went around and like beat the crap out of the rabbis. And that was his main thing, is that he went around as an active preacher, a community organizer, and a fighter who opposed the rabbinic Judaism of his day, which was embodied by the Pharisees and Sadducees. And the goal was actually, I'm going to introduce two terms to you that I want you to start thinking about. First of all, positive Christianity might call it a corruption. You could call it a heresy. It is, in fact, a bridge religion, a bridge faith. It has a purpose. The goal was not actually to get anybody to believe positive Christianity or that Jesus was a Nordic Aryan or any of this crap. The goal was to turn German Christians into National Socialists. And so it is a bridge faith. It is, in other words, something that they were offering the Christians. The Nazis at first were offering the Christians this as a palliative so that they didn't scare them off, because they were not actually friendly to the Christians. You can read that pretty thoroughly. I've been reading a little bit in Alfred Rosenberg's books, a couple of them. I haven't read very much of them. One is his memoirs, which he published in 1946 after the war. One is a book he published in 1930 called Myth in the 20th Century, which is where he actually developed the idea of positive Christianity. Notice the date there, 1930. But the Nazi Party actually has in its, as we covered in an earlier episode of the podcast, in its 25 principles that it put forth in 1920 from the very beginning. Notice 10 years before Rosenberg puts ground under the idea of positive Christianity in an Aryan sense, the Nazi Party platform claimed in point number 24 that the religion of the Reich would be positive Christianity. And that was given with zero content to what it meant, except that people knew generally that they might have known that generally there was this theological dispute. We're going to focus on Jesus' life rather than his death. And it had no content. It was merely a palliative, so they didn't scare Christians off. Then this Alfred Rosenberg is Hitler's chief ideologist. He stays in this role all the way through the entirety of the Nazi experiment, the entire Third Reich. He is the guy who's writing out the ideology. His goal is to figure out how to articulate the Nazi ideology and to bring Germans into it. And so he invented positive Christianity in the Aryan sense as a part of that. He derived it largely from, as in his own words, he derived it largely from reading Houston Stewart Chamberlain's book. Houston Stewart Chamberlain's a gigantic bridge character to the Nazi ideology coming into being. But he gets this idea from Chamberlain's book, which was called Foundations of the 19th Century, which I have not read. So full disclosure on that. I have not read Chamberlain yet. But Hitler was taken in by Chamberlain. Rosenberg based a lot of this on Chamberlain. So in 1920, just a timeline summarized, 1920, the Nazi Party says we're going to use this thing called positive Christianity. This taps into an existing, particularly popular in Germany, theological debate about do we focus on Jesus' life or the meaning of Jesus' death as Christians. And then in 1930, in the Myth of the 20th Century, Alfred Rosenberg, who is Hitler's ideologist, outlines this idea of positive Christianity as a bridge faith to get German Christians no longer to just feel safe, but to adopt a bridge religion, a ersatz religion. That's the second term I want to give you, ersatz, which is spelled E-R-S-A-T-Z. Ersatz means substitute or false or fake. it's like a knockoff. Okay, so it's a knockoff religion, but it's there as a substitute. He wants to create a substitute religion that will serve as a bridge that takes people from Christianity to Nazism. That's his purpose. He's not ambiguous about his purpose. He's absolutely clear about this purpose. And he lays out these crazy ideas that I was just kind of articulating to you. He claims that he gets this idea himself in the myth of the 20th century from Goethe, but it precedes Goethe. This is a debate that had been going on in German Christianity for some time. Just to give you the context, what's going on is he's basically separating Christian belief into these kind of two things. And this, I'm not going to go through all of chapter 1, race and race soul of the myth of the 20th century, but I'll give you a little bit. He doesn't start here. He actually is going on and on about the way the Greeks, who were like secret Nordics, by the way, the big super giga Chad Nordic Greeks. And then you have these, Jews who are coming along polluting things. And Paul, you have, is just this character. He's very unhappy about Paul. And I'll just read this one footnote here, by the way. It says, despite Rosenberg's claim, there is considerable evidence that Jesus was in fact Jewish. He was a Jew from birth because his father Joseph and his mother Mary were Jews. Joseph, we read, is of the house of David, ... Okay, so yes, Jesus was a Jew. But okay, so I'll start a little further up than I meant. The idea of the Trinity. This is Alfred Rosenberg in The Myth of the 20th Century, 1930, in the section which is called Race and Race Soul, where he outlines the meaning of positive Christianity, which, by the way, he only mentions twice in this book, which has 600 pages. So it's not like it's this super common thing he's just ranting about. He says the idea of the Trinity, for example, was familiar to many Mediterranean people in the form of the Father, the Mother, and the Son. And in the precept, everything divides threefold. The mother symbolized the fertile earth, the father, the creative principle of light. Now, in place of the mother, there appears the Holy Ghost as a conscious retreat from the purely physical. Such was the Hagion Pneuma, Holy Spirit, of the Greeks and the Prana of India. The spirituality and its emphasis were not rooted in a racial national ground conditioned by the polarity of organic life. Instead, it became a force without direction. So this is how I know I've thrown you into the middle of an argument, but he sees that there's this corruption in Christianity of what was really meant, which is this underlying racial national ground conditioned by the polarity of organic life. And that Christianity adopted a false form specifically to negate that or to deny that. He says that he goes on to explain, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither man nor woman, wrote Paul to the Galatians 3:28, the Galatians being the last remnant of a great Celtic migration down the Danube Valley and into Asia Minor. Notice that they're Celts, okay? On the basis of this nihilism, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, is nihilism, according to Alfred Rosenberg. On the basis of this nihilism, which is a denial of everything organic, there's this, again, idea, the organic, underlying this is that twisted pseudo-Darwinian evolutionary model that Hitler and the Third Reich all adopted. We see this in the pagan woke right very explicitly. It's kind of the strongest of the fittest in like some really weird way. So therefore, the world is separated into different animals and plants and so on, but animals in particular, and the king of the jungle is the strongest and most brutal. And so the strongest, most brutal, most powerful rises up. So evolution actually produces stronger, more powerful forms, and this is true not just in animals, but in human races. And obviously the Aryan for them is the strongest and most powerful race, and therefore the pinnacle of evolution, and therefore it should conquer everything because it's stronger. That's the everything organic that's under here. We covered that in an earlier episode. So on the basis of this nihilism, this is he's accusing Paul of being nihilistic for his statement in Galatians. On the basis of this nihilism, which is the denial of everything organic, he then calls for a belief in Christ. This constituted a total rejection of all the culture creating values of Greece and Rome, although to be sure Christianity adopted a degenerate form of such values and effected their disintegration. Thanks to its strongly exclusive character, Christianity was then able to gather itself all those who had lost direction. So notice that he's now positioning Christianity, as Paul saw it, as a religion of the weak, of the downtrodden, of the lost, of the Marxist later. A further step toward the denial of natural life lay in the dogmatic assertion of the virgin birth, he tells us. Yet this is commonly a part of a solar myth to be found among various peoples from northern Europe to the South Sea Islands. Abstract spirituality, however, was flanked on each side by all the magic of Asia Minor, Syria, and Africa. The demons that were driven out by Jesus and passed into the swine, the calming of the stormy sea at his command, his certified resurrection from the dead, his ascent into heaven, all of those, by the way, are given their due references in the Gospels. All of these were the real point of departure for falsified Christianity and undoubtedly greatly strengthened the ability to endure much suffering. Thus, the world did not proceed from the life of the Savior, but from his death and its miraculous consequences. This is the single motif of the Pauline epistles. Goethe, on the contrary, held that it was in the life of Christ that is important, not his death. In this, Goethe was attesting to the soul of the Germanic West, expressed in, quote, positive Christianity as opposed to negative Christianity based on priesthood and witch mania deriving from Etruscan Asiatic concepts. And so this is quite the little read, isn't it? He goes on to talk about this. I'm not going to read a whole bunch more, but it's the same idea that we're all having this false Christianity as a result of the weak form that's given by Paul and basically all the Christians by focusing on Jesus' death and the passive aspects as they saw them of things, rather than Jesus being, as I said, somebody who goes around and beats the crap out of rabbis, which is what they really want from him. So let's see, what all is contained into positive Christianity. I've got a little bit more just to summarize. So what I'm doing, just so you know the structure of what I'm doing, is I'm presenting to you what positive Christianity actually is, so that when I go through this book, the first part of this book here in a minute about positive Christianity, written by a positive Christian, a evangelical, so a Protestant who's espoused positive Christianity, has written a definitive book, I think under a pseudonym, you will understand that what he's talking about is a bunch of shit. So what is positive Christianity? Like I said, it's a bridge faith, an ersatz religion, a substitute religion, but it's a bridge faith. Woke is, this is a better use of the word ersatz, by the way. Woke is an ersatz religion. It is not a real religion. It doesn't do the normal forms of worship. It is like a substitute religion. When you guys are out there, if you're making the argument that traditional religiosity waned and people still had the religious impulse and they filled it in with wokeness, you're saying woke is an ersatz religion. Well, positive Christianity was a manufactured ersatz religion based off of a theological debate that got crammed full of Aryan nonsense by people like Alfred Rosenberg, as we were just reading from in The Myth of the 20th Century, based on his readings, as he says, of Chamberlain, Houston Stewart Chamberlain. I'm trying to remember his first name again. And do I have that where he says that he actually got it there? No, I don't have it right in front of me. But he says directly in this book that he got that from Houston Stewart Chamberlain. So Alfred Rosenberg's view of positive Christianity is that it should be a bridge faith, an ersatz religion, but a bridge faith that merges Nazi racial ideology, as you could kind of hear the hints of. Maybe we'll go through that. I'll read it later in more detail and decide if it's worth reading the whole thing to you. But it's going to merge Nazi racial ideology, which is the core of the Nazi experiment, believing the world is structured around this combat between the races, this struggle, the Kampf between the races. Kampf means struggle. It's the same conflict theory that Marx believes is between oppressor versus oppressed, but Hitler locates it in the races instead. Hence, when it sees the means of production for the communists, it sees the means of racial production for the Nazis, and you can actually transform society, transform man, and rule the world. So Rosenberg's idea was to merge Nazi racial ideology with elements of Christianity to increasingly promote the idea of racial purity among Germans and give it a spiritual overtone. They didn't want to scare off the Christians. So instead, what they did is they ran a critical theory of traditional Christianity, labeling it negative Christianity or by misappropriating a debate in theology, and claiming that it actually distorted the true teachings of the Bible. So you get people who believe in the Bible, they probably don't know it very well, and you tell them, well, you've actually been taught wrong by all these priests who want to keep their power. There's your critical theory. Instead, this is what it really teaches, and here's why Jesus was a Nordic, and this is why the Galatians were Celts, and this is why these were all, giga chads with racial purity. And you can therefore say the real teachings of Jesus were these other things, and you cut out all the Jewish stuff, blah, blah, blah. So the idea was that this would be a transitional or a bridge faith to lead Germans into a racially based religion that aligned with Nazi principles, and maybe eventually to get them to abandon their actual Christian beliefs in favor of just raw National Socialism. He did this by replacing traditional Christian symbols like the cross with Nazi occultic symbols like the sun cross. He did this explicitly. So a cross with like a swastika in the middle of it. And this was supposed to represent some renewed German faith in an awakened Germany. And his writings on all this, as we heard, suggested more and more that the Aryan race was divine, to the point where Hans Kerrl, by 1937, is outright asserting this, and that the Adolf Hitler as Führer is a new messiah and is providing a new revelation, which sounds an awful lot like the birth of Islam. And the whole point was to set this up in the same racial dichotomy that Hitler ran from the very beginning, which is the Aryans are kind of the absolute best possible racial circumstance, and the Jews represent the absolute possible worst circumstance. And they used Christian prejudices against Jews, Christian anti-Semitic tropes and themes in order to do that, which should feel pretty uncomfortable. And Rosenberg's work in 1930 in particular, directly laid out the foundation and the groundwork for the establishment in 1933, as Mike O'Fallon told us in his post on X and on Facebook, for the establishment of the Reich Church that would align with Nazi beliefs while looking Christian, while slowly rejecting and expelling traditional Christian beliefs. So it's totally crackpot. I asked one of the AIs to summarize for me the beliefs. Let me see if we have this. I asked it a few questions because I want to have the story and the history right. So where did the term positive Christianity come from? It says in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the term was used to distinguish Orthodox belief from perceived opposites. So it's one of these arguments about heresy. And the question was, do we focus on, it says orthodoxy versus liberalism. Positive Christianity represented conservative doctrinal Christianity in contrast to the negative of or liberal rationalistic theology that emerged from the Enlightenment. So you have this counter-liberal, counter-Enlightenment vibe. Now that's going to line right up with our Theo bros and our Timu Catholics very strongly. Reject modernity is in fact one of their key talking points. The idea, reject modernity, embrace tradition. And then they hold up some pseudo-traditional presentation of their faith as the thing we're supposed to have. Affirmation of faith, it says it signified a faith based on positive, established, and revealed truths and historical revelation rather than purely subjective or philosophical reasoning. And then it talks about ecclesiastical use. And then it started to get Aryanized by Richard Wagner and his son-in-law, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who, it says, they began envisioning Christianity shorn of its Jewish context, redepicting Jesus as a, quote, Aryan archetype or an actual Aryan. And this ideological shift laid the groundwork for Rosenberg and the others to take the existing respected label of positive Christianity and fill it with new racialized content that actually rejected the traditional dogmas it originally stood for. So what I would say is that what you can see is, in kind of Mike's argument about, if you remember, he said integralism and neo-integralism, that what you have is this kind of multi-step program. So you have this idea of Christianity and Christian nationalism in America that's got a positive vibe with Christians. And now we're going to take that term and we're going to empty it of its old meaning and fill it with this new Timu Catholicism, neo-integralist. Integralism is a 19th century Catholic social, political, and economic doctrine that says that the church, state, and economy should be reintegrated into a single object. Integralism is the philosophy. And so what you're going to do is take this idea of Christian nationalism. See if this sounds familiar. This sounds very positive to the average American Christian. You're going to slowly replace its content with radical right integralist themes. This is the playbook of positive Christianity, where instead they were filling it with Nazi themes. Now, if you look at characters like Nick Fuentes and the Groypers and some of these other far more lunatic people, they are pouring Nazi themes and straight up Muslim Brotherhood, Islamist themes into their so-called traditional Christianity as they make the term Christian or Catholic or Christian nationalist devoid of their original meanings. What the Google Gemini told me, I said, just explain to me what positive Christianity is in terms of Alfred Rosenberg. And he says, Alfred Rosenberg, a key Nazi ideologue, promoted a version of positive Christianity designed to purge traditional Christian faith of its Jewish Old Testament and, in his view, quote, materialistic elements, replacing them with a racial Germanic theology. This, in his view, was to support a, quote, spiritual rather than just biological fight against Jewish influences, often emphasizing a warrior Jesus based on a folkish ideology where the point is actually the folk. Remember, the folk is the people, but it actually in the German has the connotation of being a race. So Rosenberg and his other Nazis used the term to represent a supra-confessional faith that emphasized racial and national unity, promoting a Germanic or Aryan interpretation of Jesus, often claiming he was not Jewish. So, in fact, I didn't read further in Rosenberg's Myth of the 20th Century, but he actually has this really denigrating explanation not far from where I stopped reading, where he talks about seeing, actually, no, this is in his memoirs, which I also have, where he talks about seeing a young German man approach a confessional and get on his knees. And he says, he's got this idea like, oh my gosh, is this what we've become as a people? That would be so kind of low and think so lowly of ourselves. The Memoirs of Alfred Rosenberg. It's a wonderful, wonderful little book here. I haven't read this either yet, but he has this rant about, seeing this young German man approach on his knees and says, "Is this really?" Maybe this is actually in the Myth of the 20th Century, but it's one of these two books. I was skimming them, but the idea is that no, it's in the Memoirs. Sorry, I read an excerpt of the Memoirs. I know where I read it. And so, this young German boy comes up to confess, to do his religious duty, and he sees it as a show of weakness rather than some other thing. And it's when he realizes that the positive Christianity is going to be necessary after he contrasts this against like this big burly peasant who's, feeding his son sausages and beer. It's really in the story. The core of positive Christianity, according to Alfred Rosenberg, was going to be anti-Semitic. Rosenberg's interpretation focused on combating what he termed the Jewish materialist spirit in Christianity. It was going to be anti-clerical. So that means the organized existing churches were going to be kind of, they're going to be hostile to them, low-key attacked is what I was going to say, but I didn't want to give the idea they're going to go set them on fire. The goal would be to denigrate them, to lower their influence and increase the influence of the Reich Church, which was going to be running this positive Christian Nazi ideology. And theological revisionism, his approach sought to remove the Old Testament from the Bible, interpreting the New Testament in a way that aligned with National Socialist ideology, and held up Adolf Hitler as providing a new revelation. And so there's, lots of stuff. I'm not going to keep reading AI. I don't really like AI. But at any rate, and it's really not AI, it's spell check on crack. Okay, so what I want to do now is turn to this book, Positive Christianity in the Third Reich, which was written in 1935 and republished in 1937. It's called Positive Christianity in the Third Reich by Professor D. Caius Fabricius. So I think Fabricius tells us it's not his real name, fabricated. So I don't believe that this guy is real. It took me a lot of work to try to find this book. I wanted to find out what in the world is going on with positive Christianity, and I was finally able to dig up this book. I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction, and I'm going to read the first chapter because I want you to hear how similar the arguments that an actual positive Christian were making, how similar those arguments are to what we see from our Christian nationalists, as they call themselves today. And I get that debate a lot. James, don't you think there are certain elements of Christian nationalism that are good? And I've said, well, depends on what you mean by the term, which means you shouldn't use the term. There are things that some people who call themselves Christian nationalists advocate for that I agree with, that I think are good. I would love to see a revival of faith in the Christian faith in this country. I would love to see more civic engagement by Christians. I would love to see a lot of that kind of thing. I would not love to see theonomy, where we have basically Christian law being put in through the state. I would not like to see a theocracy in any regard. So I have limits. So what I advise people is not to use that term. Well, here again, the parallelism, and this is maybe loose, but the parallelism here is that positive Christianity worked the same way. It was a term that was given largely devoid of content, that had some meaning of kind of like a return to a more less emotion, less sentimentalism, less any of that, more hardline scripture. What does it actually say? Let's focus on the life and deeds of Jesus kind of vibe, and let's focus on Jesus's life over his, just the meaning of his death. So it's not just about grace and atonement. Everything's fine. You've got to figure out how to live the right way too, which had this kind of positive valence in a theological debate and discussion in Germany. And then we're going to start to, that positive Christianity then becomes the vague term as it starts to get Arianized. It means that still, which is generally considered as good, but it also means bad things. And so Christian nationalism works the same way. So you could imagine being in 1930, we'll say that, or 1924, 25, 1930, 1932, 1935, 1937, and asked, do you support positive Christianity? And the point is that term has now lost its specificity of content. It has engaged in, if you remember my funny little bullet podcast about this, the fancy term, it has entered the realm of conceptual polysemy, which means it means more than one thing at the same time. So it depends on what the questioner means, and it depends on what the answerer means when they say yes or when they say no. It is a term. It's not exactly what is called a floating signifier, that it floats and can signify virtually anything, but it's a term that can signify a variety of different positions. I guess it is a floating signifier, which is the ambiguity in which so much nasty, manipulative, what we would call woke linguistic activism plays in. Okay, so this book is like a ad for positive Christianity, written in 1935 and edited and republished in 1937. So we're pretty far. We're 4 years into the Reich. We're the first third of the way through the Nazi party being in power. World War II is 1939, so we're not there yet. But we're 4 years deep. The first draft was written 2 years deep. But remember, the word positive Christianity was first given expression relevant to the Nazis in 1920. So we're actually 17 years deep, with Germans being at least concerned or interested, I should say, in this concept and what it means. So this guy's going to fill it in. 17 years deep into that, or 15, depending if you want the first or second publication. And so a long time. And like I said, we're also 5 or 7 years out from Rosenberg's expression, and we are in 1937, in the same year that the leader of the Reichschurch, Hans Carroll, is explicitly saying some really bad stuff about what it represents, specifically positive Christianity not being dependent on the Apostles' Creed, not dependent on Jesus as the Son of God, that the Führer is the herald of a new revelation, that is the Nazi Party is representative of what Christianity really means. And we're going to hear some of that kind of attempt to blend this. But we're going to go through the introduction and the first chapter of this book and the very beginning of the second chapter. It's not a very long book. So introduction 1. We demand liberty. This is a quote, by the way. This is actually point 24 from the Nazi Party program, which we've read before. We demand liberty. This is Nazi Party program point. They never varied from these points. We demand liberty for all religious denominations in the state so far as they are not a danger to it and do not militate against the morality and moral sense of the German race. So notice that what the Nazi Party, this is 1920 that this was written, what the Nazi Party is demanding. There is going to be religious liberty for all religious denominations as long as they are not a threat in any way to the state, or the morality or moral sense of the German race, of the folkish program. So they don't actually mean religious liberty, because if your religion had some idea like there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, man nor woman, as is in Christianity in Galatians chapter 3, that does actually militate against the morality and moral sense of the German race. There are definitely Aryans versus Jews. So you can't say there is neither Aryan nor Jew. There is neither Jew nor Greek. You can't say that. That is actually antithetical. So they demand religious liberty for everybody, but we're going to put this limit on it, which is not defined in terms of what it is. It's anything that harms the race or the moral sense of the race. The party, as such, to continue, stands for positive Christianity, but does not bind itself in the matter of creed to any particular confession. This term, positive Christianity, in the Nazi sense, has not yet been given proper content and won't be for 10 years, by the way. It combats the Jewish materialist spirit within and without us, and is convinced that our nation can achieve permanent health from within only on the principle the common interest before self-interest, end quote. Okay, so religious liberty for all religious denominations in the state, that as long as they also combat the Jewish materialist spirit within and without, and so long as the common interest is put before self-interest, and so long as it doesn't threaten the German state or its racial ideology. Such, it says, this book says, Caius Fabricius says, such is point 24 of the program of the German National Socialist Party. Since 1920, this has been the unchanged and unwavering guiding principle of the movement with respect to its attitude toward religion, and since 1933, the inviolable expression of what it is to be as law to the whole German nation. Adolf Hitler, its Führer and Chancellor, has repeatedly affirmed this article, especially the main clause relating to positive Christianity. It's useful when the word doesn't specifically mean anything, or it means something different than what most people think it means, right? This was particularly the case, Fabricius tells us, in the 3 notable speeches made by him, meaning Hitler, in the year of 1934, namely on January 30th, August 17th, and 26th. On these 3 solemn occasions, the Führer stated in words that left no doubt as to their meaning that National Socialism, this PDF's really weird, so give me a second, affirmed positive Christianity. Moreover, as a further explanation of his statement, Adolf Hitler declared that by positive Christianity, he meant the Christianity of the 2 great churches, the Evangelical and the Roman Catholic, both of which are represented in Germany. He also called upon these Christian churches to do everything in their power to make the moral forces of the gospel message effectual and influences in the life of the German nation. At the same time, however, he made it perfectly plain that he had nothing in common with, quote, people in bearskins, with those, namely, who, recalling the old Germanic tribes, would foist neo-pagan cult experiments upon the German folk. And he goes on. I'll finish the paragraph, actually. On other occasions, too, as, for instance, in his historically remarkable speech of May 21st, 1935, the Führer emphatically rejected the godlessness of Bolshevism, contrasting it with the fact that in National Socialistic Germany, the churches have not been turned into places of secular amusement. Notice the words secular amusement. And even if the Führer does speak on occasions such as these of a new National Socialistic Weltanschauung, he means neither a new religion nor a new godlessness, but simply everything that is the result of national consciousness, of the ties of comradeship and of the heroic attitude of the National Socialistic German with respect to his mode of life and his views of the world surrounding him. So even if the Führer does speak on occasion such as these of a new worldview, he doesn't mean one against ours. That's what he just said there. He's just actually saying that there are, a new national consciousness, there's ties of comradeship, there's a heroic attitude of National Socialist Germans and our mode of life, and, the views of the world surrounding him. To these may be added everything needed for the reconstruction of man's inner life, and this includes in no small degree the forces of positive Christianity. So this is a statement that the forces of positive Christianity are absolutely integral to transforming the inner life of the German through something he thinks is his faith. But even here, the guy admits, it's like, there's another whole worldview there, but, okie dokie. He says repeatedly, I'm not going to read all of this introduction, that positive Christianity and National Socialism are one and the same. Skipping down, he says, why is he writing this? It was in the need for such a treatise that justifies this thing that brought me to the fore. I am conscious of a sense of responsibility to God and to my own conscience, both in my capacity as a theological expert on confessional questions and as an evangelical Christian. I felt it incumbent upon me to proclaim the truth in all publicity. As an official of the state and as a political leader within the party, I am bound by a twofold oath to the Führer of my folk, but my religious and political duties do not clash, nor do they necessitate any inward struggle, but rather the one supplements the other, and both stand together in complete harmony. Indeed, they do even more than this. In my own life and thought, Christianity and National Socialism are closely knit together. And just because I am a Christian and a theologian, I felt compelled to put on the brown shirt. And just because I am a Christian and a theologian, I felt compelled to put on the brown shirt. Just because my innermost being is filled with the most sacred feeling of responsibility, I have felt for years past a sense of duty toward my folk in its time of distress. For this reason, therefore, my path had perforce to lead me into the movement which has been called upon these days to rescue my folk from need. My life during the past decisive years has been mapped out accordingly. So he goes on to say what he's going to make use of and what he's not going to make use of, but I'm not going to elaborate on that. I'm going to skip down to the last paragraph of the introduction before we read chapter 1 of this book, which is titled What We Reject. It says, such is the thought underlying my treatment of the question of positive Christianity as the foundation of National Socialism. Positive Christianity as the foundation of National Socialism. That's what this book is supposed to be about. It's not a particularly interesting read. I thought there were going to be some holy moly kind of moments in it, and there just aren't. But he does say here that positive Christianity is, from his perspective, the foundation of National Socialism. Now remember what Alfred Rosenberg thought about it. It was a bridge faith to get people out of Christianity and into National Socialism. It has been found advisable, he tells us, to divide the exposition itself into two main parts. The first subject of investigation to be dealt with concerns the National Socialistic policy with respect to religion. Conclusions will thereby be drawn from the party program applicable to the general attitude of the party and the state towards church life. In a second exposition, the inner associations will be treated of, and it will be shown how the spiritual forces of Christianity must needs have a great influence in the life of the newly awakened German folk. So, the newly awakened German folk is who this is for. This is the Christianity that has been formulated for them. It is likely that this pastor and theologian does not know that it was meant to take people away from Christianity and that he is drunk on the Kool-Aid. Maybe he's a cynical conspirator, but probably not. Maybe, who knows? Maybe it's Rosenberg himself writing it under a pen name. Who knows? I don't know. Maybe I'm speculating. Part 1, the religious policy of National Socialism. This I'm going to read in full. I'm not going to skip around. To forestall all, not the whole part, the first chapter. To forestall all misconceptions, we must show what religious policy would contradict the very essence of National Socialism before we judge of what is meant by the affirmation of Christianity in National Socialism. So, chapter 1, what we reject. So, in other words, what he's going to do is he's going to say, these are things we absolutely don't stand for, which is why we need a positive Christian National Socialism. Okay, and this is why I wanted to read this part, because we're going to hear many of the same arguments that the Christian nationalist movement, as it calls itself of today, is making. They don't know in many cases, I don't think, but I do think in some cases that they are walking the same path. They are being given the same talking points that led to the development of an ersatz religion within the National Socialist movement, a bridge faith to get Christians to stop being Christians and to adopt a different worldview entirely by using their Christian faith against them, which is what I think the Christian nationalist movement is doing as well. So what we reject: 1, liberalism. The whole attitude of National Socialism, it says, shows a striking difference on comparison with all that is to be included in the name of liberalism. Every singling out of human individuals, every separation of interests, confusion of opinions, every irregular appearance of selfish interests, everything that calls forth and emphasizes differences between individuals and between various groups is repellent to the spirit of National Socialism, since it disturbs the unity of the folk, breaks up the team spirit, and menaces the powerful solidarity of the nation. Okay, so everything, it starts with this criticism of the idea of liberalism is freedom. Every singling out of human individuals, every separation of interests, every irregular appearance of selfish interests. Okay? All that is against the idea of a unified folk. So naturally, National Socialism opposes it. So what they're going to do is create an argument for a positive Christianity that is against that. But this is exactly the argument that we hear endlessly from the Theobros and the Timu Catholics and the woke right, which is that liberalism itself is the problem, so we need to return to their weird view of traditional Christianity, which most traditional Christians pretty strongly don't recognize. And least of all, the Fabricius tells us, and least of all would it be compatible with National Socialism were a form of religious liberalism to find a place in Germany. That is to say, the springing up of several hundreds or thousands of religious societies, all at liberty to represent not only the old traditional teachings, but also strange and questionable doctrines, and to abuse and accuse one another of heresy. So there will be very little religious liberty, despite what the 24th point of the Nazi program starts out with. He says a religious liberalism of this kind would be far more dangerous than liberalism in secular affairs, because religion always lays claim to the whole individual and shuts off the individual person and individual groups from the world outside far more completely than do secular interests. So we should just scroll back up a minute and reread that point number 24 thing, right? From the Nazi Party platform, we demand liberty for all religious denominations in the state so far as they are not a danger to it and do not militate against the morality and moral sense of the German race. So right off the bat, it's like, oh yeah, we demand religious liberty. We're going to defend religious liberty, except no religious liberalism, which means no proliferation of denominations, because people might believe the wrong thing, and religion always lays claim to the whole individual and shuts off the individual person and individual groups from the world outside far more completely than secular interests. Okay, so religious liberty, as long as it's in line with the Reich and the Reich's morality. That's absolutely central. And again, this is the same kind of implicit argument. You read Stephen Wolf's Case for Christian Nationalism. You read Charles Haywood's batshit crazy foundationalist manifesto. Yeah. There will be room for religious liberty, but, it's going to be really limited as long as it doesn't injure the public morality and public faith of Christians. Same exact logic. I'm not saying that they recycled it directly on purpose. It's the same exact logic. For this reason, therefore, Fabricius tells us the religious policy of National Socialism is absolutely opposed to the principle, quote, pronouncing religion to be a private affair, end quote. So we're going to have public religion laid down by the Social Democrats and which was derived from liberalistic ideas in the hope of dealing a blow to the power of religion by breaking up the churches into private societies. Okay, so we're going to have public religion, not private religion. This is, again, a core argument, whether we're reading Stephen Wolf or we're reading half the other Christian nationalists. It's not going to be enough for your religion to be a private, personal affair and how you decide. And it's not even just about living your faith outwardly. No, there's going to be magistrates who are going to make sure that it's a public affair. In National Socialistic Germany, he tells us, religion is not a private matter at all. It concerns the whole folk. See, it is the body of the people itself that's at risk, so it has to be a public affair. It cannot be a private matter because it concerns the whole nation, the whole people. This is exactly what the Christian nationalists are arguing about their views. We could just say, in Christian America, religion is not a private matter at all. It concerns the whole nation. True, he tells us, one can ascribe the religious policy of the National Socialism to the utterance of Frederick the Great, quote, here each must be saved after his own fashion, end quote. But these words spoken by the great king, and which were to become proverbial, referred only to the peaceful intercourse between the evangelical and Roman Catholic Christians in his country, and must not be understood to mean an unbridled liberalism. See, so the guy said, here each must be saved according to his fashion. Frederick the Great said that. And so the pastor here, the theologian, is diving in and saying, look, that doesn't actually mean religious freedom. It means that the Catholics and the Protestants don't go at each other. That's all it means. It does not mean more freedom. So the Christian nationalists do this with every utterance that they can find from our founding fathers and try to apply it to us. But again, he says, it must not be argued here that the party program itself allows liberty to all religious beliefs. Religious liberty there most certainly is in the National Socialistic state. This does not mean, however, that a wild growth of private religious opinions and a breaking up of the churches into groups is desirable. What is implied is simply this: no one is forced in the Third Reich to adopt any form of religion. See, I'm reading Stephen Wolf's book here. Nobody's going to be forced to adopt any particular religion. You just can't not have one in public, and it's going to be very public. You're not forced to. Nobody's forced to adopt any form of religion. And again, he says, no one is compelled by the state to join any one of the great churches or to withdraw from it. Finally, it implies that within a religious body, the many individuals who go to form it are not to be confined within the narrow limits of some kind of belief. On the contrary, as everywhere in the newly awakened German folk, powers are allowed free play, those of creative personalities in particular being permitted to develop freely and vigorously. So within the great churches, as in every religious community, the characteristic features of personal piety will not be suppressed, but will be given every opportunity for vigorous development, insofar as they do not sow seeds of discord or cause confusion of mind, and so prove a menace to the spirit of unanimity prevailing in the folk. Oh, see, it's straight contradictions. Everywhere in newly awakened Germany, you can have whatever religion. Nobody's going to be compelled to join this church or leave that church or do this or do that. You have all the freedom of religion. We're going to allow all the development in every direction that people want, insofar as they do not sow the seeds of discord or cause confusion of mind, and so prove a menace to the spirit of unanimity prevailing in the folk. Unanimity. The unanimity of the folk is going to be the key thing, and somebody in the Reichschurch or in the government or somebody in the state is going to decide if your particular freedom of religious expression caused those problems. So you better be real careful how you practice your religion, what you believe, what you tell people you believe, etc. Because, man, if it shakes the German, it's all fine until the second it's not, and then you're in big trouble, because it's anti-liberalistic in its formulation. He says, but the anti-liberalistic attitude of National Socialism in matters pertaining to religion has another aspect. The liberal era has, by the way, before I read this part, I'll start it again in a second. Notice that, Jesus' command, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, unto God what is God's, is right out the window here. You're going to render unto the state exactly what the hell it wants, or else. And then you can render unto God whatever's left. Like, that's literally what's going on here. The state becomes you are not allowed to upset the unity of the people as viewed by the state. So you're going to render unto the state what it demands first. But anyway, it says, but the anti-liberalistic attitude of National Socialism in matters pertaining to religion has another aspect. The liberal era had a favorite scheme and sought to realize it in various ways. Notice that it's a scheme now. The liberal era has a scheme. It's a plan against traditionals, the conspiratorial thinking, the hermeneutic of suspicion, as it gets called. It was the separation of church and state. Dun, dun, dun. Oh man, doesn't that sound an awful lot like everything the Christian nationalist group has been arguing for like many years? The liberal era had a favorite scheme and sought to realize it in various ways. It was the, quote, separation of church and state, end quote. This catchword was not only based on the idea of the individual and private nature of religion, remember that's not acceptable anymore, but also on the view that a distinct line must be drawn between religion and secular culture. The state very specifically, but okay. This universal letting loose of individual interests resulted in a splitting up of culture in its various domains and a limited one-sided devotion of individuals and groups of individuals to special cultural spheres. Oh, it atomized everybody and broke everybody apart because people were allowed to have their own lives and live their own lives in secular ways. Oh, doesn't that sound familiar? So that's why we need the Reichschurch teaching a fake Christianity that's meant to turn us into Nazis. Indeed, these divisions in cultural life even led individuals in their philosophy of life to specialize in one particular domain of culture, whereby all other spheres were either rejected or were looked upon as of no importance. Thus there arose the practical materialism or utilitarianism of Marx and his followers, which only acknowledged techno-economical culture as of any value. There were others, art lovers, to whom the world of beauty meant anything at all, and who, engrossed by it, had lost all understanding for other things. There were men of science and circles of intelligentsia who only appreciated the intellect, despising everything else. There were humane moralists in whose eyes the highest value of all was the moral or right relationship between man, and who were only slightly interested or not at all in other spheres of life. I read way more there than I should have because there was a huge punchline there. I could send this to any Christian nationalist publication with the slightest changes and easily get this published. There's no question, right? So this is one of their stock arguments, the Christian nationalists. Indeed, the divisions, this universal letting loose of individual interests resulted in splitting up the culture into its various domains and a limited one-sided devotion of individuals and groups of individuals to special interests. These divisions led individuals in their philosophy of life to specialize so much so that they didn't care about other stuff. So we end up with Marxism. Isn't that funny? Which only acknowledged, how many times have you heard these Christian wingbats say this? Wignat, that's the word. Which only acknowledged technico-economical culture as of any value. Isn't it amazing? And then, all these other people, you got your artists, you got your scientists, but none of them appreciate the deeper things. Everybody's fragmented and broken apart. Everybody's separated because they're allowed to have secular existence, because we believe in the doctrine of separation of church and state. That's how we got Marxism. That's the problem. That's the thing we have to unwind. So what we need is a public religion, and that public religion is going to be based on this, and it's just as long as you can do whatever you want within it, as long as it doesn't upset the state or the people as regarded by the state. Right. Okay. But I love that. Which only acknowledge technico-economical culture of any value. Every time you hear the woke right guys say, James Lindsay, or whoever they don't like at the moment, just believes that people are fungible economic units. That's this, right? Which only acknowledge technico-economic culture as of any value. In other words, that people have no deeper meaning. They only are fungible technico-economical units that can be exchanged and switched and swapped and don't even matter. It's the same arguments, guys. My point, again, is not necessarily, I don't know, maybe they are just importing Nazi arguments, but my point isn't that they're importing Nazi arguments. It's that they are repeating the essential pieces of the experiment. The American experiment is being replaced by the Nazi experiment, and this is the religious domain that we're reading from now. Remember, we're reading from this book, which is called Positive Christianity in the Third Reich, that is explaining why why they had to have positive Christianity, which it sees as the intrinsic foundation for National Socialism, which a lot of the Christian nationalists say, the socialism does actually work as long as you have the nationalist element, and a nation has to have a common religion, which of course they're going to be in charge of. So I'm just saying that we're reproducing this stuff. The Christian nationalist movement, the parallels that Michael Fallon drew to the Christian nationalist movement and the positive Christianity movement are really striking, and we're hearing it in their own words. So this condition of separate and limited standpoints, he goes on, must also include the principle, quote, separation of church and state, end quote. For this phrase may be so interpreted as to mean that occupation with things is temporal, is to be separated from, let me say that sentence again. For this phrase, meaning the separation of church and state, may be so interpreted as to mean that occupation with things temporal is to be separated from occupation with things spiritual, because it is thought that the bulk of mankind is engrossed with temporal things and does not concern itself with what is sacred. So we're going to be Nazis because that's sacred. And if one goes on to presuppose that the state is without religion, that is to say, it concerns itself chiefly with secular interests, the principle may be inferred, quote, separation of church and state. So this is the kind of argument, again, we hear from the Christian nationalist contingent about the separation of church and state. You hear it in a variety of different forms, but the separation of church and state is often laid as one of the foundational failures of America, even though the phrase came from Was it Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists? A wall of separation, I think he called it. Now you can argue, did he mean to keep the state out of the church, or keep the church out of the state, or both? What's actually meant? These arguments are to be made, but what this says is, if one goes on to presuppose that the state is without religion, that is, it concerns itself chiefly with secular interests, the principle may be inferred, separation of church and state. And the guy very clearly said that the conclusion of that is Marxism, through practical materialism, utilitarianism, Marxism, and the atomization of people, which only acknowledges the technico-economic culture of having any value and separates everybody into their own spheres of life rather than having them concern themselves with what is sacred together. So instead, the conclusion, remember, was, so what we need is a public religion. What we need is a state-endorsed religion, which is this vague thing, positive Christianity, which can be any Christianity at all, have all the freedom of belief, of denomination, of church that you want, as long as the state is okay with it and you don't upset the unity of the German people as measured by the state. This principle, Fabricius tells us, this principle, however, is totally opposed to the nature of National Socialism. Separation of church and state, however, is totally opposed to the nature of National Socialism. Do I need to say that in like slow motion? The separation of church and state, however, is totally opposed to the nature of National Socialism. Did you get it? The principle of the separation of church and state, however, is totally opposed to the nature of National Socialism. The whole meaning of the new life in Germany, remember, is an awakened German, not woke, awakened, not woke, awakened. Just awakened, not woke. They're not woke, okay? They're not woke right. Woke right is nonsensical. They're not woke. They're just awakened. The whole meaning of the new life in Germany, as revealed in National Socialism, is man's desire to leave behind him the gulfs and schisms in cultural spheres, all the specialization, mutual distrust, suspicion, and hostility, and to form instead an organic, living, coordinated culture which, notwithstanding its manifoldness, is yet permeated with the one spirit common to all. The various spheres of culture must naturally be differentiated. We are fully aware that the physically useful in technico-economic culture is different from the aesthetic beautiful, and again that the investigation of truth is a thing by itself, just as is care for the community of mankind. Also that religion, as the surrender to the superhuman life of the Godhead, differentiates itself from all connections and activities which bind us to humans and temporal things. But at the same time, we know that the differentiation between the spheres of life must on no account mean a severance or schism, but that they have their common roots and foundations in human nature and in the nature of things, and are further united and interwoven by countless reciprocal effects. And the National Socialistic state is no pagan holding aloof from the church as if from the sphere of what is sacred. On the contrary, the state is the lawful organization of the living folk, of the same folk that possesses the whole of temporal culture, and with it religion. So, are you as uncomfortable as I am? Because this could be in any Christian nationalist magazine in the world, or in the United States anyway, maybe Britain, any of them, all of them. Like, there, a lot of people have this thing, like I've got this beef with Yoram Hazony, the national conservatism guy, and he's got his whole view of nationalism, which is, he's got his definition. He feels like he's imposing upon the world, and he can't figure out how all these ethno-nationalists and anti-Semites and racists and kinists and all these really bad, unsavory characters that he gave a stage to made it into his movement. And it's because he's got this idea of a nation as a people, as a folk. That folk is not necessarily bound racially, as with the Germans, it's bound culturally and religiously. And if you don't have a common culture, then you are not going to be able to have a common bond or a common foundation for your nation, your community, your folk. Okay, so it's not a racialist folk, it's a culturalist folk, and the culturalist folk is based in a religious cultural unity, and this argument applies exactly to the situation he's making. But this is an argument for National Socialistic positive Christianity. And again, my argument's not that you are going to end up with Nazi ideology necessarily, but it's that the same exact errors are present. And you actually do have National Socialist elements and Nazi elements and kinists and racists and anti-Semites who see things exactly like the rest of the National Socialist program inside. And guess what? They're more intolerant than you. So they're going to take over your movement. And, Yoram probably did not intend that, but he has nothing in his construction that can stop that. When you start getting into this idea, on the contrary, the state is a lawful organization of the living folk, where that folk is defined by their religious bind, but the religious bind can be as loose as it needs to be, of that same folk that possesses the whole temporal culture and with it religion. What you end up with is a situation where these lunatics and cranks have found their place, and you don't have grounds upon which to expel them or stop them from basically conquering and ruining your movement from within. It's kind of sad, but it is what it is. So notice again, though, this intrinsically contradictory nature where we recognize, right? We are fully aware that there's all these important distinctions, but at the same time, it can't go to the point of schism. It can't go to atomization. So what they're doing is writing themselves a blank check. The woke left does this too. They don't tell you where the boundaries are. They just tell you what's not acceptable. And in fact, what they do is erode the boundaries. So since you have no idea where the boundaries are, but they do in some loose tacit sense, you all just have to listen to them. Well, the same here. You're allowed to have all the freedom you want as long as the freedom that you express doesn't threaten national unity or morality or the state. And you can have all the differentiation in your society as you want as long as you recognize that it can't split people apart or atomize them into their own worlds. You've got to have that binding element still mediated through public religion. He says, in the folk, too, the organization of the state must naturally be in living reciprocal connection with the organizations of all the other spheres of culture, including the church. From the standpoint of National Socialism, therefore, it is impossible to assert that the new movement has nothing to do with religion owing to its political character, and that the state must stand aloof, not concerning itself with ecclesiastical matters, just as the church keeps aloof from state affairs. A religious policy with this view as its basic principle would remind one of the French Revolution in the 18th century, but certainly not of the national uprising in Germany in the year 1933. So he's equating separation of church and state with the French Revolution, but not with what the National Socialists did when they took over in 1933. Okay. So here, though, he's being very explicit. I want you to be very clear. He didn't just say that the state should be in the church. He says that that the church should be in the state. He says also that the state should be in the church. Both. The separation of church and state is to be utterly obliterated under National Socialism and in the view of positive Christianity. He says a policy of aloofness and alienation with regard to the relations between church and state would indeed be most disastrous. It would open up a fatal chasm between church folk and the worldly minded and cause a front to be formed at least as dangerous, if not more so, than the former gulf between the bourgeois and the proletariat. See, oh no, we have to unify church and state. Otherwise, the church people and the secular people will turn into a conflict like the Marxists, and we'll have it all over again. And moreover, he says, in a church obscured from the light of publicity, dark places would be created where under the protecting mantle of sacred things, revolutionary elements could foregather and threaten the German folk and all it holds sacred with dissolution and destruction. So if you only have private churches, people could hide behind religious liberty and foment a revolution, and that would be terrible. Of course, we actually have that problem, and we actually have people using that problem to say that our Constitution is useless to stop it because it allows for religious liberty. But if we had a state church, we would be able to stop the encroachment of Islam, which could actually be stopped constitutionally other ways, but we'd have to be much more forceful about how we actually are willing to apply certain concepts and certain laws. Okay, so secondly, what they reject. 2, attacks on Christianity. There will be no attack in Christianity under positive Christianity. They reject it. There will be no attacks on Christianity. Does it sound familiar? More alien to the essence of National Socialism than the separation of church and state is any attack on Christianity. Never mind that in Alfred Rosenberg and Hans Carroll's own description, positive Christianity itself is an attack on Christianity. Never mind that. It's a subversive one, though, so it's not an overt one. It's a covert one, so that's okay. So there will be no attacks on Christianity allowed. Although, like we already heard, they were antagonistic to, or they attacked the traditional churches that weren't the Reichschurch, so that they could diminish their membership and increase the memberships of the positive Christian Reichschurch. Okay, so let's see. Antagonism to the Christian religion, he says, is much more compatible with the spirit of Jewish materialism rejected by the party program and closely corresponds to the spirit of Bolshevism, the deadly foe of National Socialism. Now, if I haven't been accused of that a bunch of times because, and other Christians that I know, every Christian I know who stood up to the Christian nationalists has got called a Jew. And a Marxist, and saying that, defending liberty means you're defending Marxism. I think my favorite episode of all this is when I came out with a campaign a year ago or so called Liberty First. I thought, who could reject this? This will be fun. Liberty First. America's all about liberty, the cause of liberty. That's the spirit of 76, Statue of Liberty. Like, liberty's kind of in our bones. And I thought, liberty first. And the Christian nationalist gang attacked me viciously. I think they kind of won. They kind of beat me down with this because they got a bunch of Christians to go with them and say that if you say liberty first, you don't mean God first. Which, when I talk to anybody about this, I tell this story sometimes outside of, like, the conservative movement in, like, the, like, brainworm infested Twitter sphere. And people are like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, liberty is why we can worship God. And I'm like, I know, I thought that was normal. But no, liberty first meant that James was putting something secular ahead of God, and James is bad. He's terrible. He hates Christians because liberty first means hating Christians. Same exact story. Antagonism to the Christian religion, including like a campaign in a country that's literally built on liberty, called Liberty First. Antagonism to the Christian religion is much more compatible with the spirit of Jewish materialism rejected by the party program and closely corresponds to the spirit of Bolshevism, which, by the way, is not big on liberty, the deadly foe of National Socialism. If, as in Marxism, material pleasures and manual labor are to be regarded as the highest values, the time-honored institutions are to be trampled underfoot, while spiritual values are held to be merely elusive phantoms, and it is considered unworthy for any human being to believe in a higher life, then it must naturally follow that churches are blown up, priests are deprived of their rights or even murdered, and the propagation of religious beliefs forbidden, and all suspected of piety subjected to suffering. So, yes, Christians and Christian churches are being attacked. It's absolutely unacceptable. It's a very concerning thing. Definitely communists are into this. Definitely the Muslims are in, like the radical Muslims are into this 100%. This is like bread and butter stuff. This is why you see so much more of it in Western Europe and in Canada than in the United States so far with churches, although it does happen in churches. But what does he say causes all of that stuff? He says, in Marxism, yes, but that corresponds to any antagonism of the Christian religion according to their views. So if you don't go along with their program, that's going to cause churches to be blown up. That's what he's arguing here, and that's insane. That's literally nonsense, especially when what they're doing in this case was literally Nazism. So if you don't go along with Nazism, that's antagonism against Christianity. Antagonism against Christianity is Jewish materialist and Marxist, and Marxism causes churches to get blown up and people who are religious to be attacked. National Socialism, he says, on the other hand, as a movement emanating from within and testifying at every turn to how great is the power of the Spirit, perpetually striving to awaken man's noblest instincts, summoning him to obedience, to respect, to self-abnegation, and to sacrifice, would contradict itself. Nay, more, it would destroy itself, were it in any way to promote anti-Christian activities or to tolerate such machinations even in their very beginnings. Like, I don't think this guy knew what Hitler and Rosenberg and so on thought about Christianity, but it's not like they're not doing good here. I wonder if I can find that. I don't want to sit here and look for something. But oh my gosh. Yeah, Rosenberg. So an excerpt from Rosenberg's memoirs. Okay, so by Alfred Rosenberg, the chief ideologist, the creator of the positive Christianity, the pastor is defending here, 1946 in his memoirs. What Hitler's own religious beliefs were, he never told me in so many words. Once at the table, he said a high-placed Italian had asked him point blank what his religious beliefs were. He had begged permission not to answer that question. In his speeches, Hitler frequently referred to providence and the Almighty. I am certain he was inwardly convinced of a fate predestined in its general outlines, but preferred not to formulate what parts compulsion and free will played. He became more and more convinced that Providence had entrusted him with a mission. This became noticeable upon his return from his incarceration in the Landsberg and grew ever more evident after the Maktubersnahme, until toward the end of the war it assumed positively painful proportions. This conviction that as Bismarck had once been chosen to unite the northern Germans in one Reich, so he was chosen to bring the southern Germans, the Austrians, into this Reich, it was certainly deep-rooted into him. As for the Christian concept of God, Hitler definitely rejected it in private conversations. That I know, even though in the course of the years, I heard only 2 or 3 prominent remarks. Once he told me, quote, "Look at the head of Zeus. What nobility and exaltation there are in those features. About communion, quote, it is primitively religious to crush one's God with one's teeth." End quote. He held against Gothic art that it symbolized everything dark and brain-beclouding. Later on, he granted at least the impressiveness of the cathedral at Strasbourg. When in the course of these conversations I ventured the opinion that one could not destroy the churches, but one could merely attempt to fill them gradually with new people, he replied, "That is a very wise thought." Fundamentally, as far as his attitude was concerned, Hitler had very definitely discounted churches and Christianity, although he fully acknowledged the importance of their initial appearance on earth, granted everyone the right to his own conviction, and supported the Wehrmacht and its religious and confessional demands. So, not a big fan of Christianity, says Rosenberg, but also generally disinterested. You just thought it was primitive, right? It was just primitive. So here we have this dipshit defending positive Christianity, saying, on the other hand, National Socialism as a movement emanating from within and blah, 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 would destroy itself even if it were in any way to promote anti-Christian activities or to tolerate such machinations even in their very beginnings. Hitler had the very beginnings. Rosenberg had the very beginnings. Rosenberg was using positive Christianity as a bridge to get the stupid German Christians to become Nazis. And this idiot either is going along with it or doesn't know it. Marxism, he says, coined the phrase that socialism is as much opposed to Christianity as fire is to water, and it may here be said that National Socialism, its relationship to anti-Christian activities is that of fire to water. But it's not real Christianity, right? And so you have this same idea, like they've created this, ersatz Christianity, and anybody who opposes it hates Christians, and their whole movement is going to hate people who hate Christians, and they're going to whip up actual believing Christians in a fight saying, look, it's us, the National Socialists and the Marxists, that's it, that's the whole fight. You're either with us or you're against us, and those people are being anti-Christian, they're against us, so either you're with us against them or you're against us. And that's the friend-enemy distinction, which is their core political framework, and it works. It works. This is the same dynamic that's happening today. He says, and if there should be a few individuals in Germany today who, with regard to this point, prefer to swim in the old channel of the last era, scoffing at priests and devout people after the manner of Marxist freethinkers, looking askance at anyone professing to be a Christian, even preventing him, we call these, by the way, the lingo for these people today is 90s liberals or 90s atheists, 90s secularists. And if there happen to be a few individuals in Germany today who want to go along with that old way of thinking, even though it's in the manner of Marxist freethinkers, looking askance at anyone professing to be Christian, even preventing him perhaps from attending public worship and looking upon the clergy of a Christian church as second-rate citizens, then it is a sign that such people have not yet grasped the significance of the new era and are rather to be considered as a grave menace to the peace and inner strength of the German folk. All right, two things. So if you have people who are basically your 90s atheists who are not really into this, or 90s secularists, maybe they're just like religious in their own way, but they're not getting caught up in the fervor of the new Christian nationalist revival movement. If that's happening, they just don't get that times have changed. Number one, there's two things. Number one, such people have not yet grasped the significance of the new era. So in other words, history moved on without them. They are behind the times. They are on the wrong side of history. But then secondly, they are to be considered as a grave menace to the peace and inner strength of the German folk. What do you think the Nazis did with people who were thought to be grave menaces to the peace and inner strength of the German folk? No, they are the enemy. They have to be destroyed. That is specifically the thing that said it's not allowed to be tolerated. Okay, so with the Christian nationalism of the German Reich, the Nazi Reich, you are going to be a participant in this positively. And if you think you're not, you are a menace to the peace and inner strength of the German folk, which is not covered under the doctrines of religious liberty. I'm telling you, this is the German Nazi movement, the Nazi experiment's version of the Christian nationalist movement, like down to the sentence. But he says, in passing, another misconception must be removed. This refers to the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. Long before the rise of National Socialism, there were certain national literary circles amongst the intelligentsia of the upper middle classes of pre-war days who, for the sake of their German nationality, believed it necessary to reject Christianity as being historically connected with Judaism. On the appearance of National Socialism and its attacks on the Jewish supremacy in our folk, these intelligentsia thought the moment had arrived for a similar attack on Christianity. This point of view is definitely rejected by the clause referred to in the party program, and it is unnecessary to examine it further here. So what is that? What's going on here? What he's saying is, okay, so there was a big current of German anti-Semites who were criticizing Christianity. Actually, let me make sure I get this right. So there were these intelligentsia, pre-war days, for the sake of German nationality, reject Christianity as being historically connected with Judaism. So now you have, okay, pre-war days, you had these, that's right, okay, so you have these thinkers who are arguing that the church has replaced Israel historically. And so Christianity it has to reject its Jewish origins. And so then the National Socialists come out and say that they're super anti-Jewish, right? So the appearance of National Socialism is attacks on the Jewish supremacy in our folk. These same thinkers, these intelligentsia, thought the moment had arrived for a similar attack on Christianity. So the attack is that that Christianity has Jewish roots. This point of view is definitely rejected by the clause referred to in the party program, and it is unnecessary to examine it further here. Besides, it is clear that the spirit of the Christian faith has nothing to do with Judaism. We National Socialists are combating. So, we're going to split the Judaism, right? Our attacks are directed against the present-day Judaism, the ally of the powers of destruction, which in all secrecy, through the agency of banks, bourses, and press, seek to rule the world. There's your Protocols of the Elders of Zion, by the way. So they're not actually necessarily mad about the ancient Israel connection here, although actual positive Christianity did reject that as well. They're actually saying, no, the Jews of today are not the Jews of old. The Jews of today are a completely different thing, the present-day Judaism, the ally of the powers of destruction, which in all secrecy through the agency of banks, bourses, and press seeks to rule the world. We oppose, he says, the mixture of our race with that of Jews. Moreover, we have liberated our folk from the dominating power of Judaism, and we are constantly on the defensive against all attempts to renew this supremacy. I think that sounds fairly familiar to all of us right now that are dealing with the woke right, but nothing is further from our intention than to confuse the spirit of this kind of Judaism with the Christian religion and to attack the Christian faith as, quote, Jewish. Such an act would be an absolute contradiction both to the essence of Christianity and to the spirit and program of National Socialism. So the certain intelligentsia came out, attacked Christianity as being a Jewish religion, after the Nazis adopted Christianity as its backbone, trying to catch them in the contradiction. You follow a Jewish religion, you accept Christianity. And he says, no, that's true. We're against the Jews of today, not the Jews of old. But at the same time, positive Christianity was rewriting the history of Christianity to write the Jewishness out. So they agreed with those intellectuals, but not with their critique of National Socialism, the attempted gotcha there. 3, they reject substitutes for religion. That's ersatz, religion. Isn't that ironic, right? National Socialism, he says, has as little desire to found a new religion, lie, as it has to attack Christianity. Attempts of this kind must rather be considered a menace to the unity of the folk and demanded by National Socialism. It is already a historical disaster that the German folk is fated to have not only one but two great Christian bodies, the evangelical and the Roman Catholic churches. Wise statesmanship of the highest order and a personal desire for peace is constantly demanded in order to preserve the inner solidarity of the folk under such conditions. Okay, so here he's saying, okay, we got the evangelical church, that's 2/3 of Germany, and we've got the Catholic church, that's 1/3 of Germany. It's already hard enough to stay unified. We're not going to create a new religion, though, to solve that problem. That's what he's saying, which is kind of not true. Positive Christianity is a bridge religion. The new religion is called National Socialism. He says, but how increasingly great is the difficulty when a third religion confronts the two great Christian churches and in opposing them claims the right of calling itself the one and only future religion of the German folk. That's National Socialism, but he's saying that's not what's happening. The difficulty, however, becomes a very grave danger when the exponents of such a new religion declare their ideas to be the philosophy of life in actual agreement with the spirit of the German race and with National Socialism. See, so you see the hide the ball game happening here? If we investigate the substance of the new religion that would appear to be offered to the German people as a substitute for Christianity, we're filled with a deep and genuine dismay. First of all, we get the impression that it is not the case of one religion but of a great many, and men of learning as well as various writers dispute as to which of their systems is to become the true spiritual food of the German folk. It is to be expected, however, that these learned men and writers will continue to disagree, as they have hitherto been doing, and so we have a picture that is both bewildering and disintegrated, and is likely to remain so. Thus there is danger of not only a third, but a fourth, fifth, and even more cults being founded, each of which lays claim to be the only true religion of the folk. Neither are the doctrines expounded in these new religions at all promising. Some are simply echoes of Christianity. Others, and to a greater extent, are reminders of the philosophy of the rationalists and their glorification of humanity and reason, or of Nietzsche's naturalism, with his deification of those who are in communion with nature and are critical of culture. Sometimes, too, there is a revival of Indian ideas of self-redemption. All these beliefs, however, are but pale wraiths lacking the force, the depth, and the richness originally peculiar to those thoughts and systems. Neither is surrender to what is supernatural and superhuman the predominant feature of the new cults, Rather do we find a glorification of nature and of man in particular, who is held to be sufficient unto himself and capable of attaining perfection by himself. So here we're in the internecine fights of Protestant Christian nationalism, Timu Catholic Christian nationalism, and the pagan woke right domain. The basic principle, he says, of these new cults is accordingly the same as in the case of the older movements of free thought and free religious belief of the last epoch. The only difference is that these same ideas, which were considered applicable to mankind in general, are now spoken of as being essentially Germanic. All such aims are contradictory to National Socialism. The Führer, with the exemplary modesty characteristic of his whole being, decisively forbids any honor to be paid to him which is fitting for God alone, and all genuine National Socialists follow his example. When the Führer states on occasion that he, quote, has faith in the German folk, and when we National Socialists profess, quote, our faith in the Führer, that does not mean the conception of a new religion. It is simply a confession of trust and confidence between man and man, and is included in our trust in God, but is by no means that trust in the divine power itself. We are well aware, and the Führer himself has made frequent mention of it too, that we are only instruments of the hand of divine providence, however great that human endeavor may be, which has been so effectual in the great turn of history we are now experiencing, and which is still effectual. So Hitler did seem to believe in providence. I think that's legit, but I don't think he believed in providence. I think he believed that it was providential that he and people like him rule the world, right? It's a kind of a different view. That there was a right way to live in the world, that they had cracked the code, and it was meant to be that they were going to that the German Aryan was going to rule everything. So anyway, and we likewise, he says, refuse to deify those earthly forces which laid the foundation of the German uprising and are still basic principles. Race, blood, soil, freedom, honor are to us high values, and it is of lasting worth that National Socialism has so firmly impressed the supremacy and importance of these forces and virtues upon an uprooted mankind and a sick folk. We will not and dare not relax our enthusiasm for those sublime things, but we know that such things, sublime and glorious as they may be, are yet of this earth and are human, so that although we may consider them as willed and created by God, we must not look upon them as supreme divinities themselves. I'm thinking this guy is just straight running cover for Rosenberg's conception, but I digress. These facts require constant reiteration of the full light of publicity, not only for the sake of the matter itself, but also because we know that in other countries the enemies of New Germany are busily engaged in spreading slanderous reports as to how Germany is in the thraldom of paganism, and that Christians are being persecuted by the state for their faith's sake. News of this alarming description are not only reported by Christians, but are also propagated by Jews and pagans, and the foreign press, if at all hostile to Germany, wallows in such reports and gives them full publicity, particularly in those papers that in past years completely ignored ecclesiastical questions. These slanders are published with the intention of prejudicing Christians of every other land against Germany, so that they may close their ranks and form as solid a front as possible against our folk. So everybody's against them. So what he's talking about is that outside of Germany, people that are paying attention, especially people that are not sympathetic to the Reich, are noticing all these weird pagan elements and dark things in National Socialism that's being practiced like its own religion. And so he says we have to be more public about what National Socialism really is and its relationship to Christianity, because these people are using all of our pagan elements against us, and convincing Christians around the world to unify against us. So what he's running here is this whether it's, Bonhoeffer within the German church, or whether it's people out in the press around the world pointing out what National Socialism really is, that it's a state idolatrous fascist ersatz religion, they're all using that. He's claiming to cause Christians to unify against Nazis, as they should. He says, so what we have to do is use positive Christianity and proclaim that no, that's not the case, to make sure that we don't have a unification of Christians against our cause. He says we must first defend ourselves against such defamations. See, because he really believes that positive Christianity is Christian and what they're doing. Today, he says, the German people amongst the nations of the earth is the strongest bulwark against all the powers of darkness threatening to the overthrow of Christian culture. Doesn't that sound familiar? That's what our Christian nationalists say, even though they have this really not correct Christianity. Indeed, we may say, the powers of dissolution and disintegration that with sinister and diabolical strength are striving for mastery in the world today are nowhere so effectually repulsed as in National Socialistic Germany. Heard this argument before. For this reason, all foreign nations who fight us as being non-Christian in their eyes find themselves in very tortuous and most dangerous paths, and insofar as they are Christians themselves, combat in their appalling delusions those very things for which they would stake their lives. So he's basically saying that all the Christians out there that are opposed to the Nazis and saying that the Nazis are pagans and they're not really Christians are actually trying to destroy the best protection of Christianity in the world, even though he's participating in fake Christianity meant to turn people into Nazis, which is anti-Christian. But they alone can protect Christianity. We've heard these arguments before, right? So everybody who fights them as being non-Christians doesn't understand that they are actually contributing to the destruction of Christianity, because only National Socialism is preserving Christianity, even though it's not. In view of this, so this is so parallel to in my opinion, what the Christian nationalists are doing. Like, only they can save Christianity from the pagan and secular forces of the world, and all the Jews and whatever else out there. Only they can save Christianity. But people who attack Christian nationalism as a defunct power broker movement filled with radicals and yahoos and dilettantes and retards, those people actually are cutting their nose off, right? So if you have a good conservative Christian who's fighting back against Christian nationalism, the argument is, well, that person actually thinks they're doing the right thing, but they're hurting what they profess to protect. And that's what it says here about Christians around the world who are claiming that Nazis are non-Christians or anti-Christian, is that insofar as they are Christians themselves, they combat in their appalling delusion these very things for which they would stake their life. So you think of your favorite Christian who's fighting back against the woke right. Joel Berry, for example, is a good example a lot of people are familiar with. And this is what the Christian nationalists say to him, that they are protecting Christianity. So by attacking them, he's actually trying to kill Christianity, even though he claims it for himself, because he's in a delusion of Jewish, secular, materialist, or whatever thought. You've heard the arguments before, again and again and again. In view of the situation predominant in the world at present, it is doubly important for us to defend National Socialism unceasingly and untiringly against the defamatory reports that it favors paganism, be it openly or secretly, and desires on the strength of its authority to introduce a substitute for the Christian religion, which is exactly what it's doing. Positive Christianity is a bridge religion. It is meant to replace the Christian religion with a vaguely Christian-ish Nazism. So that's chapter 1, what they reject. Chapter 2 is what we affirm. I'm only going to read about the first page and change. 1, the first thing they affirm is positive Christianity. It says, abandoning negatives, let us now ask the question, what is the religion upon which the new life in Germany is to be constructed in accordance with the basic principles of National Socialism? Notice that it's all going to be in accordance with Nazi ideology. What is the strong, life-giving spiritual food upon which the the soul of the newly awakened folk is to feed? The answer is positive Christianity. But what is positive Christianity? It means, at any rate, the religion that has grown and become as one with the spirit of the German nation throughout the history of centuries. It's a good sign, right? When they don't give you a straight answer when you ask them, what is positive Christianity? Next sentence is meaningless. That's a red flag, right? But what is positive Christianity? It means, at any rate, the religion that has grown and become as one with the spirit of the German nation throughout the history of centuries. All he said is, it's what we're already doing. He didn't actually tell you what it is at all. This is why I found this book frustrating. The rest of this book, we're on page, the way the PDF is numbered, page 13 out of 38. So we're not quite a third of the way through the book, or about a third of the way through the book, including all the formatter, so a little short of a third of the way through the book. At no point in the remaining 2/3 of the book does it ever actually say what it's for, what it is. I was really frustrated. I'm looking for a nice, tight explanation of positive Christianity, what it believes, what it articulates. It never actually says it. It just, they know what they reject, and then it goes vague like this. What is positive Christianity? It means, at any rate, the religion that has grown and become as one with the spirit of the German nation throughout the history of centuries. The utterances of the Führer have made this perfectly clear, and undoubtedly it is in accordance with the essence of National Socialism. Yet another sentence has gone by where no answer has been given. For everywhere this movement forms connections with all the noblest powers it discovers and knows to be national in the German spirit. We have the first hint of an answer, which is something to be national in the German spirit, but it still hasn't said what it actually is. Thus, it is perfectly natural that the new movement should seek contact with the religion so intimately woven by countless living associations into the history of our folk, both in past history and the present day. Still, the entire paragraph that starts with, but what is positive Christianity, does not tell you what positive Christianity is. But let him go on. Positive, here he puts that in quotes, positive means here as everywhere, quote, the real thing. Okay, so Christianity, positive Christianity means real Christianity. He still hasn't told you what it is. He still hasn't said shit. Positive means here as everywhere, the real thing. But in the case of a spiritual power like religion, it means what is a historical reality. Still didn't tell you. A special meaning, however, within this general interpretation may be given to the word positive, and with it to the term positive Christianity. The real thing, he says, I have to do this stupid thing, hang on. The real thing may be understood as something opposed to what is artificial, supposed, or pretended. That didn't really answer the question yet. The real thing may be understood as something opposed to what is artificial, except literally it's the opposite. Supposed or pretended, literally the opposite. Thus, a difference has been made between the positive historical religion and a rational philosophical trend of thought. Taken in this sense, to profess positive Christianity would be to reject all systems of free thought. Oh, so positive Christianity means rejecting the things you already said you reject. You still never told us what it means. Just like the friend-enemy distinction. You don't know who the friends are. You only know who the enemies are. The state tells you who the leader tells you who the enemies are. They declare the enemy. And then you're supposed to go against the enemy that they declared. And the friends are everybody who does it. But they don't tell you what actually qualifies somebody to be your friend. So thus, a lot of your friends end up as really bad people, or actually enemies that you shouldn't have had in the first place. Because friends are the people who are willing to fight the enemy when the sovereign has declared the enemy. Same thing here. Taken in this sense. So remember, positive means the real thing, so when we apply the positive Christianity, the real thing may be understood as something opposed to what is artificial or pretended. Thus, a difference has been made between the positive historical religion and a rational philosophical trend of thought. Taken in the sense, to profess positive Christianity would be to reject all systems of free thought and free religion together with all would-be rationalistic interpretations of Christianity. Still never told you what it actually is about. I'm telling you, never does. Again, quote, positive Christianity may be taken to mean what is universally known as, quote, practical Christianity, which is a Christianity not exhausting itself in expressing convictions of faith, but one active in loving one's neighbor. That's loving your neighbor. Okay, like wearing a mask, like so grandma doesn't die, like letting in immigrants because Jose across the border is your neighbor too. Loving your neighbor. Positive Christianity means loving your neighbor. And rejecting the liberalism. But this sense of the word positive must not be strained too much in interpreting positive Christianity. Oh yeah, don't work too hard on it. A political party, it's like literally you have Christianity and then you have positive Christianity, but don't focus too much on the positive part because it doesn't fucking mean anything. That's why. It's a fake term describing a fake thing so that they can get you to believe a fake thing so they can take you off the real thing and put you onto Nazism. A political party program like that of the National Socialists has most certainly not taken upon itself the task of pronouncing a limited and special type of Christianity to be its religion. Still hasn't said what it is. Moreover, the program itself adds that, quote, it does not bind itself in the matter of creed to any particular confession, end quote. Hence, generally speaking, it is obvious that nothing else except the historical and real Christian religion is meant, which, as the living religion of the folk, cannot be confined within a narrow scheme, but always encloses within itself individual opinions and points of view in abundance. So, what do we accept? One, that's the whole section, by the way. Positive Christianity. Okay, we accept that. What is it? Don't know. We accept it. That's what we accept. What do we reject? Liberalism, separation of church and state. What do we accept? Don't know. Moreover, the program itself adds that it does not bind itself. It's anything you want, right? No, as long as it's not liberal, as long as it doesn't threaten the morality of the state or the folk. But here we have like the Christian National, and me being goofy and trying to make a point through drama aside, here we have the part where it feels very much like Christian nationalism. What does Christian nationalism mean? Don't know. How many times have you had this conversation? You were like, oh, well, I think it means, no. What does it really mean? You don't know what it means. Nobody knows what it means. It is a floating signifier. Here, what he's confessed is that positive Christianity is a floating signifier. It doesn't mean anything. It could point to whatever they need it to point to later. Whatever you're doing is part of what it rejects if they don't like what you're doing. But otherwise, you're good to go. Anything goes as long as they don't mind you doing it. Do you understand how that sets up tyranny? It's the same thing as a stupid Christian nationalism. Nobody knows what it actually refers to. What does America as a Christian nation actually refer to? Culturally, politically, legally, and how, in what regard? Do we have magistrates operating as like, part of the state? Do we have a Christian prince like Stephen Wolfe wrote about in A Case for Christian Nationalism that's higher than the president? Like, what are we talking about here? But he says, just to reread that last part, hence, generally speaking, it is obvious that nothing else except the historical and real Christian religion is meant. That's what the Christian nationalism is. Christian nationalism is just the historical, real Christianity that Americans have always practiced. Really, what is it? Well, not what these libtards are doing. Well, but what is it? Not that either. Well, are Mormons? Hey, stop asking questions, right? That's what it is, just the historical and real Christian religion as a living religion of the folk. So it's just what Americans have always believed. It's just what we're already all believing. That's what positive Christianity is. Just what that's what Christian nationalism is. It's just what we always have always been. We've just forgotten it because we went secular and liberal. We got atomized and we believed in stupid stuff like separation of church and state, right? It's just the historical and real Christian religion that the folk has always practiced, and it cannot be confined within any narrow scheme unless it upsets the morality of the folk or the power of the state, in which case it must be destroyed. Isn't that funny? Isn't that funny? But it encloses itself within itself individual opinions and points of view in abundance. So, it has lots of thoughts. As long as they don't threaten the morality of the state, it's going to be public. Never actually says what it is. Like, you can find more in Rosenberg talking about what it is. Like this whole discussion about whether or not, we're going to focus on Jesus's life or Jesus's, the impact of Jesus's death, whether Jesus was an Aryan warrior who snuck down to the Middle East to crush rabbis, or whether, he was a rabbi teaching peace and prosperity or whatever. The next section of the book is this huge, he just goes back to his never-ending fight about the evangelicals and the Catholics, Germany's two churches. Spends a lot of time in the book talking about that. I'm telling you, he never actually answers the question. I'm not going to read more of the book, but just to kind of tell you what we affirm: positive Christianity, the two great churches, and the German evangelical church. That's what they affirm. What we stand for: the recognition of Christianity by the party and the Christian standpoint of the party, which are very short sections. They're not particularly exciting. And then there's this, I thought, part 2, which is the Christian foundations of National Socialism, kinship with God, love for one's neighbor, redemption, would be very interesting. And it turns out they're not. The guy never says anything. Once he gets to the point where he actually has to say stuff, he doesn't say anything at all, like pretty much nothing. So it's a big letdown. I was really hoping to, have some good stuff. But what we hear is that what positive Christianity is an ersatz, fake Christian religion. It is not real in the sense of being actual Christianity, but it passes itself off as real. And it is actually meant as a bridge faith, but they are trying to hide and deny that fact. It is meant to bridge people off of actual Christian belief and onto National Socialist ideology. And it tries to, this guy at least, who's writing under what appears to be a fake name, Caius Fabricius, is trying to hide that fact. They don't want you to know that. He doesn't actually want people to know that. So what is it? I don't know. It's the same thing as Christian nationalism. It makes the same arguments. It seems to be this kind of like shift from a theological belief. It's a bridge faith. How do you get a bunch of people who believe Christianity? This is the problem the Nazis were solving with positive Christianity. This is the way I want to phrase it. How do you get a bunch of Germans who believe Christianity? 2/3 of them are Protestant, 1/3 of them are Catholic. How do you get them to accept a new political theology called National Socialism? And you create a political movement posing as a theological movement called positive Christianity to do it. That's how you get a bunch of German Christians, many of whom may not be particularly educated, though some are, who are faithful. They are devout, at least to some degree. They're also, for the time, modern and somewhat secular. How do you get them to adopt a totalitarian political faith called National Socialism based on the racialist worldview? The answer is that you create a unclear fake religion that sounds like what they already believe, work them up into believing it, but this is a political move posing as a theological move, right? And this is why it's the same thing as our Christian nationalist circumstance. Christian nationalist circumstance is a political move disguising itself as a theological move. The goal is to install a new post-liberal politic to get people in positions of power through this appeal to a new Christian nationalist theological movement that's not real. The real movement is political, posing as a theological movement. And it's just so interesting that it has exactly the same enemies: secularism, specialization, separation of church and state, liberalism, atomization, too much freedom of religion where it hurts public morality, religion being primarily a private affair between you and God. It's very, very interesting that it has the exact same kind of things. Let me just read, I guess, to close 3. What do we stand for? 1, the recognition of Christianity by the party. Let us now consider more closely the relations between National Socialism and the Christian religion. It is taken for granted in National Socialistic Germany, the internal peace which has always been the Führer's chief care, that the Christian religion professed by the overwhelming majority of the nation should be regarded with the utmost reverence. This would be This would also be the case even if a ruler were a free thinker or if the sentiments of his entourage were professedly anti-Christian. Again, it would be extremely unwise on the part of men holding high offices in state and party if they permitted anything, however trivial, that would promulgate the idea that they wish to interfere with the Christian faith and the furtherance of Christian life. A deep respect for and recognition of the Christian religion on the part of the state and the party have important consequences for the position of the church within the nation. The church is to be unconditionally allowed all the privileges becoming to its dignity and which can be claimed by any statutory corporation. It is granted entire liberty to preach the gospel with all the means at its disposal and to preserve and promote Christian life. It is the duty of the guardians of public peace to protect church services and all church institutions with the utmost rigor against defamation and ridicule. In fact, to repulse every act of violence directed against the church and its representatives. So the idea is that you have a political move here that is going to install a state apparatus to protect a church, but the only one that church or the state will protect is the one that supports the unity of the folk, and the unity of the folk as recognized by the state. So this is just a reintegration of church and state. So when Mike, in his post that I opened this up with, is talking about neo-integralism, that is at the center of this entire project, whether it's Christian nationalism today or positive Christianity then. This part of the book is finished, the last paragraph, but another more weighty question arises for us, the core of the whole matter. Wherein does the interconnection consist between the Christian religion and the National Socialistic view of life, or Weltanschauung? We all know that's the racialist Weltanschauung. It is not sufficient for us to know that according to point 24 of the party program, both belong together, nor is it enough to find that the Christian religion forms a kernel of National Socialistic views of life, or Weltanschauung. Rather, must we investigate the nature of those forces which, emanating from the spirit of Christianity, permeate the whole life of the people. Inversely, it must be determined in how far those forces proceeding from free thought are inadequate or detrimental to the life of the folk. And above all, we must keep in view how far Christian forces are conducive to success in the present heroic fight of the German folk for life and honor, and to what extent pagan forces are a hindrance. But this makes a new and thorough investigation necessary, which is titled The Christian Foundations of National Socialism, which is as much poppycock as what we just read. These guys were co-opted in order to do a job, and I think the same thing about the Christian nationalist movement. It is a political movement disguised as a theological move. It is a bridge belief to where it's not about Christians becoming politically active, about bringing their faith actively into civic life and letting themselves become servants who answer to God, which is the sales pitch. It is about creating a belief structure where a certain line of political thought, kind of co-written in a Christian way, is meant to work as a political move against our country, which does provide religious liberty in our First Amendment. So I don't know if you found this alarming or not. I find it alarming. I find the parallelism of the arguments that Christian nationalism today makes and the positive Christianity movement, even when it doesn't quite seem to know what it's doing. I find that parallelism to be extremely concerning, but I think I just gave you the explanation. What you have is a political move posing as a theological move to create what looks like a religion that is actually an ersatz faith, a bridge religion to take people off of true Christian belief and onto a political agenda that they are using Christians to accomplish. And that, I think, is exactly the best way to put the parallel between Christian nationalism and positive Christianity. Again, my argument is not that we are reinventing the Third Reich here. Positive Christianity was a tool. The goal was the racial Weltanschauung. You could hear the tension there even on that. The goal here in the United States may not be a racial Weltanschauung. It's probably something a little more complicated. The woke right have a different view of nation than the Nazis did. They do not see except for the more pagan ones among them, they don't see a ruthless evolutionary fight for the strongest people in the world to take over everything. Some do, but a lot of them don't. I think it's an opportunity for a lot of fairly shisty and bad acting people to claim political power in our American system, and then to try to reorganize our political and economic structure in order to, they say, benefit the common good, but in reality that means benefit them, and that's the neo-integralism, I think. So rather than us moving toward a national socialistic model, although some people do, looks like more like moving toward a neo-integralist model using the same political play that positive Christianity served. That's my read on it anyway. But that is a little introduction, not a very good one, I don't think, to religion in the Third Reich as part of the Nazi experiment. The goal was that you needed to get lots of people who believed in Christianity, 2/3 Protestant, 1/3 Catholic, to pervert their faith to support a political movement. And that move is being repeated, although slightly differently. Since so many of these people are Jew haters, the same ending that I always give to every one of these episodes still applies. I don't know whether the anti-Semitic faction or the anti-anti-Semitic faction will win, but there are both within the Christian nationalist movement. A lot of them are actually, Semitic agnostic or Jewish agnostic. They profess not to have an opinion or to care. They profess to be neutral on the issue. I don't know which faction actually wins, but I do know that I'm seeing a political movement disguised as a theological movement, and that theological movement is a bridge off of true religion onto politics pretending to be religion. And we've seen this move before. And there's enough Jew haters out there to say, and enough Jew agnostics not to defend them, to say something like never again is always, so therefore never again is now.